For someone who's supposed to be my vassal, you seem far too interested in albedo. I would be a fool to miss this opportunity, my lady, Ludmilla replied. It isn't every day that one can witness a polearm user so skilled. Lady Shaltir snorted. Skilled, huh? Rather than her skills, I would say the main thing that she has is her skills. They're not something you can steal. Even knowing that something is possible is valuable in itself, Ludmilla replied. In the time since Rantel was annexed, her experiences made it abundantly apparent that the world had an unfathomable depth that completely escaped the largely mundane views of Estais and Baharuth. Ludmilla had been blessed with a liege who had helped her to escape the conceptual cage that she had been raised in, yet she knew that her journey to understand the world had barely begun. The greatest obstacles on that journey were, similarly to her own upbringing, the myriad conceptual frameworks in which the people of the world viewed reality. Everyone had lines drawn between possible and impossible, fact and fiction. The power of a race, how advanced a society was, and what one had been exposed to all factored into their capacity to analyze what they perceived and enact their will upon the world. Ma, it's as I always say, isn't it? The desire to learn and improve is a laudable thing. Our tournament here is meant to similarly encourage everyone's growth. Ludmilla shifted slightly in her seat as the Sorcerer King's deep, regal voice rolled over her. She had been in his presence for much of her visit to Nazarick, but she still had a hard time quelling the turmoil he stirred within her. At least she could maintain her outward composure so long as he didn't suddenly pop up in front of her as he occasionally did. If it's about that, Lady Shaltir said, then you should learn from me. I use a polearm as well, yes. I am, my lady, Ludmilla replied. But I am not limited to learning from one source, am I? Lady Shaltir sniffed and made a show of scanning the arena's stands. If Ludmilla was to be perfectly honest, Lady Albedo's combat style was far more relevant to Ludmilla's than Lady Shaltir's. The Prime Minister mainly wielded her weapon with both hands. Lady Shaltir, on the other hand, wielded her shortened lance with one hand while keeping her offhand free to cast magic. It was a strange contrast to how clerics usually fought, which was to hold a shield while using their free hand to either wield a weapon or cast magic. While the school of combat passed down to Ludmilla by her parents did include one-handed spear use, usually together with a shield, her position as a captain saw her using her weapon with both hands. She did pick up things here and there from her liege, but it wouldn't be accurate to say that Lady Albedo didn't offer much more. That being said, it was still a monumental challenge trying to make sense of what both were doing. Neither of them exhibited the logic of veteran combatants. As both were immortal beings, this was especially puzzling. Nothing they did suggested that they were incorporating the wealth of combat experience that they should have possessed. Instead, it seemed to mostly be a combination of sheer, overwhelming physical ability and some effort to puzzle out how to fight on their own. Ludmilla could only assume that they were both so powerful that their opponents had no chance of prevailing in personal combat no matter what they did. As a result, Ludmilla couldn't gain any insights as to the nuances of combat between powerful melee combatants. Lady Shaltir told her that all Lady Albedo had to offer was her skills, but that was literally the only thing of value that Ludmilla could draw from both Lady Albedo and Lady Shaltir in the tournament matches. The noise of the denizens in the stands grew louder as the arena filled for the evening match. It was a fight of particular interest to Ludmilla as it would showcase a battle between a warrior and a magic caster. This was a rare contest in reality due to how armies and even small parties organized themselves. No commander in their right mind would expose their casters to close-quarters scenarios if it could be helped. The only time melee combatants tended to get within range of an opposing force's caster line was after a surprise breakthrough where said casters were already depleted or caught unprepared. What I still do not understand is the prevalence of skills over martial arts in these matches, Ludmilla said. Are they so vastly superior that no one here uses martial arts at all? I don't see anything wrong with relying on skills, Lady Shaltir said. It isn't as if anyone can defeat our warriors in combat just because they don't have martial arts. Ludmilla wasn't sure if that was the case. The reuse of weapon skills was limited by a timer. In exchange, many came at low to no cost to execute relative to spells. Skills with short timers tended to have no mana cost, but only had a strength comparable to basic martial arts. As weapon skills got stronger, their timers became longer and some had a substantial mana cost attached. Given how long it took to regenerate mana, she suspected that weapon skills became a liability in protracted conflicts. Martial arts, on the other hand, were only limited by the endurance and focus of the user. It was a sizable exertion for novices, but less of a problem for more powerful individuals. Additionally, if one used a magic item that nullified fatigue, or they didn't get tired in the first place, a proficient martial arts user with exceptional mental fortitude could probably keep going indefinitely. Also, martial arts seemed to be able to combo far earlier than skills. When fighting opponents around Nazarick near her level, she hadn't seen any demonstrate the same sort of explosive technique that Lord Cocytus was capable of. By comparison, martial arts users could start combining techniques as early as silver rank. This felt like an undeniable advantage over weapon skills, as the realities of combat tended to favor killing one's opponent quickly rather than standing around waiting for timers on skills. Stillness fell over the crowd as the lighting dimmed and Lady Aura appeared under a trio of spotlights. The Dark Elf Ranger raised her hands with a wide grin. "Welcome, welcome, one and all to tonight's main event. And, boy, do we have a treat for you." In the blue corner, measuring in at 105 centimeters and 20 kilograms, we have the Disciple of Disaster, Mare Bellofiore. The stands erupted into cheers, emanating mostly from the denizens of the 6th floor and a gaggle of the royal household's maids, Miss Alpha included. On the arena floor, Lord Mayor recoiled from the sound, timidly shrinking in on himself as he nervously clutched his staff. In the black corner, measuring in at 170 centimeters and 4,800 gra. An unearthly roar drowned out Lady Aura's voice as Lady Albedo charged Lord Mayor's position. Lord Mayor let out a startled cry and fled, his feet pattering over the sand as he tried to escape his opponent. Cheating. The Guardian Overseer jumped the gun. "Be brave, Lord Mayor." Neither contestant appeared to heed the calls from the crowd. Ludmilla frowned as Lady Albedo's pursuit took far longer than expected. "She has flown much faster than this in previous matches," Ludmilla half said to herself. "What is going on? It should be that, shouldn't it?" Lady Shaltir said, "Albedo is a demon who delights in tormenting the weak. Not that Mayor is particularly weak, but his reaction practically begs for you to tease him." So it is a tactic? Was Lord Mayor purposely exploiting an inescapable part of Lady Albedo's demonic nature? What did Lord Mayor intend to do with the time that he bought? It was impossible to read the Dark Elf Druid through the look of sheer panic on his face. Glaza was being taught how to fight by Lady Aura and Lord Mayor, however, so her best guess was that Lord Mayor was silently casting enchantments on himself to maximize his fighting potential after the surprise attack. Or a vicious swing from Lady Albedo's bardiche caught Lord Mayor in the waist. Ludmilla winced as he flew into the wall of the arena, throwing up a cloud of dust upon impact. She wasn't alone in her reaction. Across the stands, many of Nazarick's denizens were standing in their seats, exclaiming their dismay or looking on with worried expressions. Several moments later, the patter of panicked feet resumed. Lord Mayor emerged from the cloud of dust, continuing his tearful flight around the arena. Lady Albedo floated after him menacingly. "I wouldn't exactly call it a tactic," Lady Shaltir said. "It's just how he is, isn't he?" Ludmilla sighed. She knew Lord Mayor displayed a timid nature most of the time, but it was disappointing nonetheless. "I know he is still a child," she said, "but boys should possess a bit more fortitude." "Should he?" Lady Shaltir tilted her head. "Mayor is the way that he is because it's the way he's supposed to be." Her frown deepened at Lady Shaltir's highly problematic statement. Did she expect Lord Mayor to remain a child forever? The ignorant might assume that she was speaking from the standpoint of an undead being, but even the undead were capable of change. The Sorcerer King often expressed a desire for his subjects to learn and grow. Despite this, those same subjects seemed to want the exact opposite. They were satisfied with the way things were and pursued ideals that were similarly unchanging. His Majesty's forbearance on the matter of his subjects' rebellious attitude wasn't something Ludmilla could manage. Perhaps it was merely the patience expected out of an immortal. Or, once again, Lord Mayor was smashed into the arena wall. When he emerged from the cloud of dust this time, however, an ominous sound accompanied his persecuted cries. Yufufuf yufu, yufufuf yufu. What is that noise? Ludmilla asked. It's albedo, Lady Shiltier answered. The dreadful sound served to spur Lord Mayor onward in his ever more frantic flight. Eventually, he ran right out of the arena, his tearful cries echoing down the same tunnel he had entered through. Lady Aura hopped down from her platform with a somewhat disgusted look. Winner, albedo. The applause that followed was polite, at best. Ludmilla stared down at the open binder on her lap, where the fresh page intended for any useful notes on the fight remained untouched. What was the point of that? She muttered. Asserting her position as first wife, I believe, Lady Shiltier's silvery voice took on a sour note. Ludmilla couldn't understand it. She knew that Lady Shiltier and Lady Albedo were contending for a place at the Sorcerer King's side as his principal consort, but what did Lord Mayor have to do with that? She turned her gaze upon the black-armored figure standing smugly triumphant in the middle of the arena. On a whim, she measured how in line the Prime Minister was with the Sorcerer King's will. As I thought. Naturally, no one could be perfectly in line with the will of another, but Lady Albedo was clearly out of any reasonable bounds. Ludmilla turned to address the Sorcerer King. Your Majesty, she said, is this truly all right? Well, I suppose it didn't make for a very good match. If I may presume to say so, Ludmilla said, I do not think it is beneficial for Lord Mayor's development if his hard work is suppressed by people terrorizing him. Ah, that's what you meant? The Sorcerer King crossed his arms, then let out a sigh. I admit that I'm not particularly fond of it. Still, when one becomes a working member of society, one has to deal with far more complicated forms of suppression, no? Ludmilla stared at the hem of the Sorcerer King's robe, her mind working to grasp the purpose behind the God of Justice's unexpected question. Realistically speaking, Your Majesty, she said carefully, I cannot recall any record of a perfectly just society. Even in the legends where bards are free to stretch the truth in fantastical ways, no one ever claims that this can ever be achieved. However, that does not mean one should accept injustice if they have the means to help put it to an end. Yet what is injustice? The Sorcerer King asked. In the past few years alone, I have come across countless people who will assert one version of justice or another. What is fair and unfair, moral and immoral? Quite frankly, some of them have left me at a loss for words. It is something that I have been wrestling with, as well, Ludmilla answered. As Your Majesty says, everyone has their own version of justice and the differences become extreme when comparing certain races. Justice according to Deer means that the wolves will starve, after all. So you mean to say that reconciling different versions of justice is practically impossible? That a country that counts multiple races as its citizens is similarly a futile venture? If that was the case, UAE. A distressed cry rose from behind the Sorcerer King, followed by the familiar pattering of a child's feet. Lord Ines. Miss Albedo was so scary. Lord Mayor ran right into His Majesty, burying himself in his black robes with a pomp. Lady Aura came behind him with a cross look on her face. Mayor, she said as she grabbed her brother by the collar and yanked him away, you are being rude to Lord Ines. You are you. The Sorcerer King placed a hand on Lord Mayor's head. Now, this was supposed to be an exercise, wasn't it? Was this Mayor's plan all along? Lady Shiltier mused. I wonder what Albedo would say if she saw this. Lady Shiltier, Ludmilla said, why is it that Lady Albedo never comes up to speak to the Sorcerer King after her matches? A self-imposed restriction, Perhaps. Her liege replied, she spends every free moment training for her matches these days. After begging for all those items from Lord Ines, she can hardly afford to lose. I suspect that she's going to request something outrageous if she sweeps the tournament. Ludmilla wasn't sure about Lady Albedo not being able to afford to lose, but she had won all of her matches in the tournament thus far. Supposedly, the secret to her success was the fact that she had borrowed various items from the Sorcerer King, which she used to directly counter each of her opponents. Despite becoming aware of her preparations, all of the contestants who faced her stubbornly refused to make similar adjustments to their equipment. Are you not worried about your match with her tomorrow, my lady? Not particularly. Lady Shaltir was no exception to the odd behavior of the Sorcerer King's vassals. The fact that she constantly strove to improve as both Ludmilla's liege and the Minister of Transportation made it all the more confusing. On the other side of His Majesty, the twins' energetic chatting petered out. Ludmilla took the opportunity to remind them of their schedule. Lady Aura, Ludmilla said, Lord Mayor, I believe we have some studies to conduct in the library. Right, oh. Look at the time, Lady Shaltir said. I need to go and do my rounds. Ludmilla, I'll see you later tonight? Yes, my lady. A few days after arriving at the Great Tomb of Nazarick, Ludmilla had established a fairly consistent schedule. She helped test security with Lady Omega in the morning up until the midday tournament match. After that, she studied in the Great Library of Ashurbanipal until late at night, with the evening tournament match acting as a break in her session. At some point, she started feeling sorry for avoiding Lady Shaltir. She was presumably visiting with her, after all, and set aside some time late at night to spend together with her on her floors. Occasionally, she would visit one part of Nazarick or the other if she felt it necessary, but she didn't like imposing on others while they were seeing to their duties. Ludmilla smiled and waved as Lady Shaltir bid the Sorcerer King good evening and left the pavilion. His Majesty looked between Ludmilla and the Dark Elf twins. Studies? The Sorcerer King said. Yes, Your Majesty, Ludmilla said. We spend a few hours in the Great Library of Ashurbanipal investigating a certain selection of tomes. A certain selection, you say? Would you mind if I take a look at what you're studying? We are at Your Majesty's service. Lady Aura and Lord Mayor flanked the Sorcerer King as they left the arena. Ludmilla fell into step behind them, pondering His Majesty's behavior. Simply put, he acted in an excessively polite manner, often to the point of appearing deferential. Of course, she understood that everyone behaved according to their setting, but it seemed strange that the Sorcerer King would switch from one set of formal behaviors to another, especially when the latter was in what should have been the most casual environment. If anything, the most relaxed His Majesty had been in her recollection was not in the heart of his domain, but when they were out in the Katsa Plains. Come to think of it, that wasn't the first time His Majesty struck out on his own. He had gone on independent outings to the Baharuth Empire and the Azalizia Mountains. Plus, he had spoken fondly of his adventuring days with his comrades at some unknown point in the past. Her ability tended to show him to be at odds with himself when he acted as a sovereign, as well. A god-king whose heart lay in adventures to far-flung lands? It wasn't that ridiculous when she thought about it. There was an abundance of accounts where great leaders preferred the path of conquest over home rule, and how Saradnik's founder had notoriously stuck to his adventurer roots, leaving the routines of rulership to his subordinates. Ludmilla's eyes traced over the dark folds of the Sorcerer King's luxurious robes. Was His Majesty happy with the way things were now? She couldn't bear the thought of him being truly miserable. Rather than heading straight to the library, they stopped by the tournament's festival grounds to pick up some food. To avoid being swarmed by his subjects, the Sorcerer King had Lady Aura and Lord Mayor line up for their preferred dishes while His Majesty waited out of sight on the other side of a nearby grove. The Sorcerer King cleared his throat. Now, where were we? Yes, Your Majesty, Ludmilla said. I do not believe that the difficulties encountered when trying to reconcile the fundamental differences between races mean that any attempt to do so is a futile venture. We have present-day examples of multiracial countries in the form of the Arguland Confederation and the City-State Alliance. I'm particularly interested in how things work in the City-State Alliance. Why is that? The Sorcerer King asked. Because Arguland is a relatively young country, Ludmilla answered. It came into being after the demon gods alongside most other countries in the region. Based on my knowledge of history, young countries always have some sort of linchpin that holds them together. In the case of Arguland, a group of dragon lords hold permanent seats on the country's ruling council. Unity is likely maintained through their martial strength, though I do not know how invasive the application of that strength is in the everyday lives of the citizens. So you draw parallels between Arguland and the Sorcerer's Kingdom in that sense, the Sorcerer King said. But is it truly something to take issue with? Lady Corlin would call it a problem of efficiency and resilience, Ludmilla said. It only gets worse the more we depend on it. Martial strength can serve as an answer to many challenges, but it is not necessarily the best answer. In many cases, it can lead to issues. Additionally, the loss of that strength leading to the downfall of a society is not an uncommon tale. Have you become aware of a foreign power that might bring about that downfall? It would be foolish to assume ourselves unassailable, but no, Ludmilla replied. In the case of the current Sorcerer's Kingdom, it is a matter of projection. My experiences so far have made it abundantly clear that we have the power to strike down any specific target, but, like any nation, we are subject to the same realities when it comes to law enforcement and maintaining general security. Even more pressing is our ever-growing deficit when it comes to qualified public servants. The latter problem wasn't one that could be easily solved. From the outset, the Duchy of Rantel had lost over half of its resident nobles, the city's administrative staff was completely gone, and it was practically impossible to attract talent from abroad. With their sudden expansion into the Abelian wilderness, they were starting to cannibalize their already limited resources. While the elder liches could handle accounting, record-keeping, and other menial office tasks, attempts to put them in leadership roles had ultimately proven them unsuitable. Never mind running a fief, they couldn't even fill in as a village magistrate unless one wanted the villagers to be managed like a small undead army. The Sorcerer's Kingdom needed to raise a new generation of administrators, but it was growing far faster than the existing establishment's ability to provide. Quite frankly, the institutions required to match the pace of the Sorcerer's Kingdom's growth were still in the nascent stages of development. What does the City-State Alliance have to offer that Arguland doesn't? The Sorcerer King asked. History, Ludmilla answered. The members of the City-State Alliance are the remnants of a country that was destroyed by the demon gods. Despite this, its citizens largely still identify as the people of Carnassus. In other words, any significant martial might that Carnassus possessed was lost 200 years ago, yet their society avoided devolving into the tribal anarchy that cynical thinkers would expect it to. I see, the Sorcerer King stroked his majestic chin, so you seek an answer to the Sorcerer's Kingdom's current challenges in Carnassus. I already know what the answer is, Your Majesty, Ludmilla replied. It is the specifics of that answer that I'm interested in. And what is that answer? Culture. The protocol through which the realities of a society can be translated according to an individual's nature. Over countless centuries, the old country of Carnassus devised a way for all of its member species to become part of the same societal fabric despite their fundamental differences. The culture of Carnassus was so resilient that it survived the demon god's rampage and did not require overwhelming martial might to maintain in the aftermath. When you put it that way, the Sorcerer King said. It is far more complicated than most people would think. Yes, Your Majesty, Ludmilla nodded. What makes it even more impressive is that the City-State Alliance is politically unstable. It is a society without a single country presiding over it, yet it perseveres even as the remnants of Carnassus vie for political and economic dominance over their peers. That does sound odd. Do you know why this is? According to Countess Wagner and Baroness Gonnier, it is the same thing that keeps the country from reforming. Every city-state in the City-State Alliance claims to be the true successor of Carnassus. So their national spirit is so strong that it's sabotaging any unification efforts. It may be as your Majesty says, or perhaps it is not strong enough. Without a more thorough investigation, I cannot rightfully claim to know what the problem is. Whatever it may be, the result is that the city-state alliance has been in the midst of a succession conflict for well over a century. A rather quiet one, don't you think? We hardly get any reports that even suggest conflict in Carnassus. They say that the balance of power is such that competition between city-states stays mostly non-violent, Ludmilla said. Loose standings are determined by prestige, wealth, political clout, and so on. Since no one can force the issue, things remain at a permanent impasse despite the ebb and flow of these softer factors. And you wish to emulate this culture? Ludmilla shook her head. No, Your Majesty, she said, I merely wish to study it, though emulation in some form may have some merit. How so? In time, Ludmilla said, I fear that the sorceress kingdom's hegemony may settle into a stagnant state due to the unprecedented security that we offer its members. Countries that have nothing better to do than turn their gaze inward have the unfortunate tendency to fall into decadence and decay. We believe that this seeming inevitability can be mitigated by encouraging healthy competition. Ho, an intriguing proposition, the Sorcerer King crossed his arms, gesturing loosely with his right hand. I've come up with similar proposals, albeit on a smaller scale, but my Prime Minister keeps shooting them down. Based on what I have seen of her work, Ludmilla said, she places an almost singular emphasis on efficiency. The only cultural events that have been proposed by the royal court do not celebrate the country and its people, but focus on glorifying its sovereign. The Sorcerer King pointed a long, alabaster finger at her. Exactly that. He said, I instructed them to come up with some cultural events and it became an endless march of Sorcerer King days. National holidays should be more national, don't you think? At this rate, I fear that our country may become deficient in various ways. What does Your Majesty desire? Things were much smaller scale back then, but something along the lines of a sports festival? No, considering how things are now, maybe local teams? Something like that. I am afraid that this concept is not familiar to me, Ludmilla said. The things that come to mind are joint training sessions conducted by the military or perhaps the arena system in the Baharuth Empire. Perhaps they share the same roots. I'm sure that creating something palpable for the citizens can help create a sense of local identity. This isn't an order, mind you, simply something I thought might be related to what you were talking about. Understood, Your Majesty, Ludmilla lowered her head. I shall endeavor to keep your wishes in mind. Well, that was unexpectedly fruitful. As twilight fell over the 6th floor of the great tomb of Nazarick, Ainz-ul-Gaun, supreme overlord of said tomb and sovereign of the sorcerer's kingdom, settled on a log in a bush outside of the arena. Standing a few steps away was Baroness Ludmilla Zaradnik, who up until recently had been slowly crushing him under the weight of topics that mere salarymen like himself couldn't hope to understand. All he could do was listen and ask questions, hoping he could steer the discussion away from eventually being made to offer a glimpse of the unfathomable wisdom that everyone somehow still thought he possessed. Fortunately, his patience paid off and they drifted to a subject that he felt he could provide input on. It was one that had turned into something of a brick wall for him. Discussion on cultural events for the Sorcerer's Kingdom resulted in one of two things: the NPCs would come up with something that had the singular purpose of exalting him and force every citizen in the Sorcerer's Kingdom to participate, or his, albeit anonymous, suggestions would be marked as exceeding the threshold of inferior, and the NPCs would unknowingly unleash all manner of scathing criticisms directly to his face. Though he bore through it all behind the shelter of his well-practiced regal bearing, it wasn't the best thing for his self-confidence. That being said, his interest was rekindled when the Baroness broached the topic. I even made improvements to the suggestion, like leaving out the gym uniforms part. The natives wouldn't know what they were, anyway. We're back. Aura emerged from the trees without so much as a rustle of leaves, bearing a steaming plate of yakisoba. Mare followed in her footsteps, cradling a bowl of curry udon. Ein sighed internally at the presentation of the tempting cuisine. While it was food from Earth, it wasn't food that normal people ate. Eating cooked food was a luxury that only the wealthy could afford on a regular basis. Indeed, the average laborer's salary assumed that one ate nutrient-paced 3 meals a day. Dinner consisting of a steak-flavored gel pack plus supplement pills cost about 220 yen. By contrast, the plate of fried noodles that Aura was holding would have handily cost a week of most people's pay. Suzuki Satoru wasn't counted as one of the impoverished, yet he still thought the price of real food outrageous and opted to save his money for other things. Yakisoba again, It's super addictive like the sign says. Ainz chuckled as the dark elf ranger plopped herself onto the log beside him and started shoveling noodles into her mouth after a hurried itadakimasu. Of course, everything about the tournament festival had been created using materials from Yggdrasil as a reference. They were idyllic scenes from the Earth that existed over a century before Suzuki Satoru's time. One raised in his circumstances might consider it all quite fantastical. In a way, it was. He didn't pretend to be in any way knowledgeable about cooking, but he was fairly certain that the in-game recipes weren't valid in the context of realistic preparation. There were too few ingredients, and those few ingredients had absurd measurements. A stick of butter, a bag of sugar, and a bag of flour to make cookies, for instance. Ein suspected it would be the case while he was investigating how Yggdrasil's equipment crafting mechanisms operated in their new world, yet it still left him scratching his head. To make things worse, the way that the NPCs didn't bat an eyelash at the strangeness of it all would have caused him to question his sanity if he didn't already know that the natives cooked normally. A long slurp sounded to his left, followed by a surprised sound from Mare. Lady Zaradnik reacted instantly, leaning forward to dab at his jacket with a handkerchief. "There's no need to rush your meal, my lord," she said, then frowned at the yellow spots left behind. "This one in particular leaves behind some terrible stains." "I got curry in my eye," Mare whined. In response, the Baroness retrieved a white towel from the satchel on her hip. Motes of magic washed over Mare as she activated the item. Mare blinked several times before resuming his meal at a distinctly less hurried pace. "You are quite good with children," Ainz noted. "Is that so?" The Baroness replied as she drew a loose lock of chestnut hair over her ear. "I suppose I had plenty of experience with them growing up in a small village. Most of my Lord Father's subjects had to tend to their work afield. People are more cautious on the frontier, so one doesn't see children helping their parents far from the village like in safer territories until they're quite a bit older. These two are usually quite independent," Ainz said, "but I worry about them nonetheless. One day, I hope I can find some other dark elves for them to mingle with." He glanced at the twins to see if they reacted in some way to his statement, but both were entirely focused on their meals. Once they were done, they took the teleportation gate to the 10th floor. The curtsying forms of Yuri and Solution shifted into view amidst the familiar scenery of the foyer. "Thank you for your hard work, Ein Summer," Yuri said. He responded with a regal nod. "Are there any urgent notices that I should be made aware of?" "Not to our knowledge," Yuri replied. "Were you expecting something in particular?" No. Just making sure. I'll be in Ashibonapol if anyone comes looking for me. Oh, by the way, is that fellow lurking in the library, that fellow?" Yuri furrowed her brow and adjusted her empty spectacles. You mean the library's other guest?" "No, he retired to his suite with a stack of books after Baroness Zaradnik's first visit and hasn't been seen or heard from since." "I see. Shall I fetch him for you?" "No. No. I was merely curious. There's no reason to bother him if he's so immersed in his studies." As Ainz Summer commands. That's the biggest worry out of the way. The last thing he needed was to get trapped in an awkward discussion with a crazy wizard. When they reached the Great Library, Librarian J guided them to a study attached to the Hall of Wisdom. It appeared that the Baroness had reserved it for long-term use as there were already piles of materials organized across the long table in the center of the room. I see you've been quite busy, Ein said. There is just so much in Ashurbanipal that I despair over how little time I have here, Your Majesty, Lady Zaradnik replied. Ma, it isn't as if you've only been allowed one visit, Eins told her. There's plenty of time to learn. What I meant was that I have come across many things that demand my immediate attention, the Baroness said. It has gotten to the point where I am afraid of making mistakes that could have easily been avoided by studying the right materials. Do you have any examples of what you're referring to? The great library of Ashurbanipal was filled with the combined contributions of Ein's All-Gowns members. In addition to 10 years of accumulated game items populating the shelves, there were tens of thousands of real books. Most had been added on a whim to simply give the shelves the appearance of having actual reading material, though what every guild member had added tended to line up with their preferences or real-world experience. Baroness Zaradnik walked around the table to pick up a stack of papers on the far end. She frowned slightly as she flipped through the sheets, then picked up a loose page on the table. Rather than citing any specific example, Your Majesty, she said, I struggle to comprehend the whole of it. Though I say that, I understand enough that I cannot help but be compelled to learn more. My effort to comprehend the world conveyed through these tomes is divided into grasping the philosophical foundations of the people presented, their beliefs, and the reality of their circumstances. The tomes I have gathered tell the story of a world more dark and alien than anything I have ever encountered before. What is she reading again? Eins picked up the nearest book and scanned the silver lettering on its cover. The 100 Landscapes of Shoah. He murmured, I believe this is one of Blue Planet's contributions. Blue Planet, Your Majesty? One of my comrades from back in the day, the Sorcerer King told her. He was the druid who designed the 6th floor. It looks like you've picked up many of his editions. He picked up another book, struggling to decipher the English on the cover for a few seconds before giving up. He flipped it open to find pictures of mountains and forests that were allegedly from Earth's past. It was probably a foreign photo book his friend had found on the internet somewhere. As was characteristic of Blue Planet, the books he added to the library mostly contained nice scenery. He sometimes spoke at length about some complicated topics, but they didn't make much sense to Suzuki Satoru or anyone else in the guild, for that matter. In that case, the young noblewoman said, I would be delighted if you would be so kind as to dispel some of the confusion that has built up over the past few days. Confusion? What's so confusing about scenery? I can't guarantee that I can clarify things for you, Eins said, but what was it that you were having trouble with? Please make yourself comfortable, Your Majesty, the Baroness said as she pulled out a seat for him. I suppose my first question is what races are involved in these records. Races? Yes, Your Majesty. While the information does not explicitly name any single race, there are sides to the information that frame things quite differently. Sometimes, it is to the point where the narratives presented are contradictory. They will even try to defame and suppress one another. At the least, they're the perspectives of several factions that seem to foster irreconcilable views. What was she talking about? Eins's gaze went to Aura and Mare, who had taken their seats on one side of the table. What's your take on this? He asked. I think she has the right idea, Ein Summer, Aura said. The stuff that we went through is all over the place. At first, I didn't think there could be anything so stupid in the Great Library, but Lady Zaradnik said that history is filled with surprisingly stupid people. History, eh? In that case, what is this history you've been studying? The Baroness took a seat on her side of the table. She tapped her fingers on the polished tabletop for a few seconds before answering. A history of folly, perhaps. One where the truth was discarded in favor of any number of comforting or convenient fabrications. The problem at the moment is that we do not know what the truth behind all of these historical narratives is. The results should speak for themselves, should they not? Eins asked. That is the strangest part of it all, Your Majesty, Baroness Zaradnik answered. Every source appears to agree on a few common things. The earth and water were ruined and the very air choked people to death. Few survived, and those who did had no choice but to subsist on what limited resources were left. Beyond that, no one can seem to agree on what happened, and few are interested in improving their situation. I guess this is what happens when you read Blue Planet stuff. Well, I guess I can see how druids and rangers would be attracted to it. He hadn't given the matter much thought previously, but the great library of Ashurbanipal was stuffed full of things that the New World's natives would have trouble comprehending. Are you worried that the same thing might happen here? To begin with, Lady Zaradnik replied, I cannot even imagine how this cataclysm was allowed to happen. Never mind the myriad factions pointing the finger of blame in every direction, other countries and different races would have surely declared a war of extermination against this threat to their survival. The civilization described here was already suffering from devastating conflicts both between member states and domestically for the same reason. Let's just say that the civilization and race spoken of in these histories was the dominant power, Ein said. No external enemy would have been able to affect any change to their course. So, even without an external threat driving them to this self-destructive end, they still decided to tread the path of ruin. You may say that, Ein said, but wasn't the result inevitable? The young noblewoman stared at him for so long that he thought he might have broken something with his question. To the side, Aura and Mare seemed to share in her confusion. I believe that is one of the prevalent narratives of the major factions that we've studied, Lady Zaradnik finally said, but much of that narrative flies in the face of common sense. It does? Additionally, she continued, much of what is written appears to reflect the platform of a demagogue, except it has progressed to a state that is far worse than any rabble-rouser that one might find in a city square. The vast majority of the narrative appears focused on discrediting other factions, fearmongering, and appealing to the base desires of the reader. To make things even stranger, the promise of future technological breakthroughs as solutions to an imminent problem are the main avenue of comfort, while behaviors that they cultivated on the way to the problem continue to be promoted. That much should be normal, shouldn't it? Not in my experience, Your Majesty, the Baroness said. A farmer who foolishly depletes the soil may see a short-term increase in yields by purchasing superior equipment, but the gains are only temporary and their once fertile fields will transform into wasteland. The true solution is understanding how the land functions and working within its limits. What if magic is used to replenish the soil? Mare asked. Then the magic caster becomes part of the system, Lady Zaradnik answered. That system still has its limits. Speaking of which, the civilization covered in these histories is quite primitive. They're even worse than Re-Estais. There is absolutely no mention of magic, nor is there any indication that the realities of class specialization have been woven into the fabric of their society. It is as if everyone is level 0, so to speak. How do I even respond to that? Of course, there was no magic on Earth, nor were there levels or job classes. There were specialists on Earth, but being one didn't grant any fantastical abilities like they did here. Even a common farmer could mysteriously produce a larger crop than an elder lich directing skeleton labor. It is the past after all, Ein said as he let his gaze wander over the books on the table. Nothing stays the same forever, and it would be quite pitiful if there was no such thing as progress. Then it must be from some distant past, or perhaps some part of the world that is even more of a backwater than this region. No, that still does not make any sense. Why is that? Because there are elemental forces at work in the world that would not allow what is described here to come to pass so easily, the Baroness answered. Doing things like clearing forests would surely invite the wrath of the forest's inhabitants. Since these people seem quite weak and primitive, I imagine that someone like the wise king of the forest would be an impossible obstacle for them. Eins briefly imagined Hamsuk squaring up against an MBT from the Arcology Wars. Would she win? Even the weak magic that she used for hunting could be used to charm the tank's crew. A scorpion drone couldn't be charmed, but he doubted that its weaponry was sufficient to damage Hamsuk through her deceptively cuddly fur. He shook his head free of wandering thoughts. Wondering how the technology from his former existence would stack up against various things in their new world was a rabbit hole he had wasted far too much time on in the past. If this civilization is so weak and primitive, Ein said, how are they relevant to us? It is their behavior that concerns me, Your Majesty, Lady Zaradnik replied. Throughout the passage of time, knowledge and technology may advance or decline, but the nature of a people is, well, their nature. The coming preeminence of the Sorcerer's Kingdom may put us in a position where, much like the civilization in these histories, no one can stop us should we end up on some unthinkably destructive path. I did mention that this calamity was inevitable, didn't I? If I recall correctly, the world was coming out of an ice age and the civilization that you're studying rose during more temperate times. As things heated up, the environment became increasingly inhospitable. Yet many of these books claim that it was a preventable tragedy. The young noblewoman swept her hand over the table. Their opponents spend so much time trying to attack what is being claimed and applying all sorts of derogatory labels to them that one can only wonder if there is something to it. Damn it, Blue Planet. While he most often came across as someone who pined after the unspoiled views of the distant past, Blue Planet's passion for nature landed him in some crazy places. His belief in the many hoaxes propagated during the 20th and 21st centuries often angered his fellow guild members whenever he brought them up. During their Nine's Own Gold days, Touch Me had become so infuriated with Blue Planet that he had nearly kicked him from the guild, calling him an insane tree-hugger, a science-denying hippie, and a crackpot conspiracy theorist. Blue Planet's views always angered the most educated people in the guild, and for good reason. According to Punito Mo, those very same hoaxes and conspiracy theories fragmented society, allocating resources, talent, political will, and precious time away from the governments and corporations that were trying to preserve as much of humanity as they could. Billions of people who could have been saved perished as a result, and the remainder were subjected to a much lower quality of life. Well, Eins decided to distance them from the contentious topic. As I mentioned, our present reality is very different from the one you've been studying. We have access to magic, for one thing. Weather can be manipulated and the soil can be revitalized. What of the problems that exist on the other end of the spectrum, Your Majesty? Are there any that you're particularly concerned with? Eins asked. When it comes to issues we are already dealing with, the young noblewoman answered, overpopulation is the most pressing issue. With the sudden takeover of the Abelian wilderness last spring, we are running a massive meat deficit. Lady Aura mentioned that we have the means to supply what is required for the time being, but, the sooner the Sorcerer's Kingdom secures a conventional supply of sustenance, the better. The problem is that being self-sufficient in this aspect would force us to convert vast swathes of territory into ranges for livestock. Trade is the other avenue we could explore, but that would leave us with a huge trade deficit. Lady Shiltir has told us that for no reason should net flows of gold ever be allowed to go negative. Aura and Mare nodded empathetically at the latter part of Lady Zaradnik's summary, which was to be expected. To the NPCs, the Sorcerer's Kingdom was first and foremost a source of revenue for the Great Tomb of Nazarick. They were all quite enthusiastic when it came to improving that source of revenue and incensed by the thought that Nazarick might lose gold over it. I take it that you are against repurposing large parts of our territory for the purposes of providing this meat, Ein said. I am, Your Majesty, the Baroness replied, but, more importantly, the residents of those territories would not appreciate their land being stolen from them. Fair enough, Eins nodded. But how long will it take us to eliminate this food deficit using other methods? The item used to supplement their food supplies, Data's Cauldron, produced a food item when one tossed a Yggdrasil gold coin into it. After Cocytus had subjugated the lizard men and taken them as vassals, it was used to alleviate the lizard-man alliance's ongoing food shortages. Back then, one coin produced one fish. That fish, in turn, fed one adult lizard man for one day. Pandora's actor was quick to point out the potential hazard that the item presented to the guild treasury. Data's Cauldron was designed to provide a small group of players with spawnable ingredients for food recipes, not feed real population centers. The Lizardman Alliance village had several thousand adult members, meaning that they consumed several thousand Yggdrasil gold coins per day. By the end of their first year under Nazarik's rule, the Lizardmen had eaten over 1 million gold coins worth of fish through Data's cauldron. Slowly, but surely, more and more fish farms were coming online to eliminate the Lizardmen's dependency on Nazarik, but the idea that a single tribal village could go through so much gold was painful to consider. I really wasn't thinking when I promised Einsak that the citizens wouldn't be allowed to eat one another. The rapid expansion of the Sorceress Kingdom came with an explosion in its demi-human population. In less than a year, they had gone from feeding a few thousand lizard-man mouths a day to hundreds of thousands, and then millions. Since he had promised prosperity to those who submitted to his rule, he had little choice but to watch the treasury hemorrhage millions of gold a day. The worst part was that the fact that the demi-human tribes no longer ate one another meant that their populations only grew. With Nazarik's defenses on economy mode, the guild base's income generation was more than sufficient to feed those numbers indefinitely. Making it much worse was to be avoided, however. Demiurge's move to cull the vast majority of the Abelian Hills population was taken precisely for that reason. That is a question better asked of my friends, Baroness Zaradnik said. Personally, I am far more concerned about the problems that the Sorcerer's Kingdom may create while it attempts to solve its existing problems. What do you mean by that? Take our meat deficit, for instance. While we might decline to clear land for livestock in favor of preserving our territories, the fact of the matter is that someone has to come up with the meat somehow, even if we trade for it. Because trade has a disturbing way of blinding all parties to the repercussions of the very activities that they incentivize, what we may consider normal economic activity may result in unintended consequences. As a salaryman who had worked in sales, Ainz had been fairly confident he could hold his own when she broached the topic of trade. Almost immediately, however, she proposed a conundrum that was unknown to him. Let us say that the Sorcerer's Kingdom begins generating a trade surplus, the young noblewoman continued. A sizable portion of that surplus will go toward reducing our meat deficit, but how does that happen in practice? Merchants will facilitate the exchange of commodities so long as the demand the Sorcerer's Kingdom creates presents them with the most attractive trade routes. It was a simple enough question. At least 2/3 of Suzuki Satoru's work dealt with entertaining or soliciting prospective customers who were in the market for his company's goods. Nothing was more annoying than losing contracts to competitors, but, in the Sorcerer's Kingdom's case, they were a huge new market that presented opportunities to everyone who wanted a piece of the proverbial pie. He couldn't see what was wrong with that. That is true, the Baroness said. But consider the fact that the previous supply for this market was everyone eating one another. Our laws have created a previously non-existent market in a very short time frame, and the supply for it simply does not exist. Feeding one of our citizens means that someone else starves simply because we can pay more. I can see that being an immediate consequence, Ainz nodded, but it's a temporary situation, isn't it? Oh, yes, Your Majesty, Baroness Zaradnik smirked. Dying tends to reduce one's demand for food to zero. Those people will not just let starvation take them, however. So you mean to say that the mere process of feeding our people will cause strife beyond our borders? But, again, it should be a temporary problem. Industry will inevitably expand to meet the demands of our population. Which is also a source of strife, Lady Zaradnik noted. The expansion of this particular industry means converting land to raise livestock on. Just like in the Sorcerer's Kingdom, there is no such thing as uninhabited land. The only people who claim such things are those who consider beings outside of their civilization as entities who can be trampled without consequence. Countless conflicts will be sparked as people are displaced to create room for livestock. I suppose the most opportunistic of these ventures would see the displaced populations as an additional commodity to sell us, an ideal one, as they have invested nothing into their growth. On that note, we may fuel war economies abroad in a similar fashion. War economies. Yes, Your Majesty. The more valuable food becomes, the more lucrative it will be to depopulate villages, towns, and cities, selling their inhabitants as meat. A war between two countries may see both sides selling conquered populations as both a way to finance their operations and clear room for their citizens. Since our citizens do not question beastmen from the Draconic Kingdom campaign being fed to them, I can imagine people elsewhere being similarly unquestioning about how their meals are being procured. When she put it that way, the optics were potentially quite bad. He had always considered the image of a prosperous nation to be a positive one, but, the way that they were going, it sounded like war and suffering would become the Sorcerer's Kingdom's harbinger. It was far from the friendly presentation that he wanted other players to see. Aura raised her hand. "I have a question," she said. "If these outsiders don't care what they're eating, then why should we? Ein Summers already laid out the rules, so we should play by them." "A valid question, my lady," the young noblewoman admitted. "My answer is that the justice of a kingdom is the truest reflection of its character. Through both statement and policy, His Majesty has conveyed the intent to create an exemplar amongst nations. One that stands as a beacon of harmony and prosperity to all who might lay their eyes upon it. Does this continue to be true, Your Majesty?" "Yes, of course," Ainz replied. "Then the first true challenge to Your Majesty's will for the Sorcerer's Kingdom already stands before us," Lady Zaradnik said. "How will this challenge be answered? In what form will the Sorcerer King's justice be made manifest?" The unexpected question froze Ainz in his seat. In truth, it wasn't something that he had ever seriously considered. Most of the time, Nazarick could just power through any problem or avoid being implicated in subversive and damaging activities. Now that they were a very visible country, however, the effects of the country's existence were all too easy to observe. How could he flub his way to an appropriate answer? Judging by Baroness Zaradnik's intense gaze, he didn't think he could escape without providing her with one.